When the war ended for them, it didn't feel like an ending at all. The trains rattled west, their windows darkened, their uniforms stripped of badges, their rifles long gone. 4 German soldiers captured in Europe. The journey across the ocean felt like falling off the map. They expected the worst. Their officers had told them Americans would treat them as criminals. Some imagined endless stone barracks, watery gruel, punishments for every word spoken in their mother tongue. Others thought of gulags they'd heard whispered about, where cold and hunger gnawed until men became shadows of themselves. What they did not expect, what they could not even imagine, was to be shocked by food. For weeks, rations in Europe had been dwindling. Prisoners were already accustomed to hunger by the time they boarded the ships. Many had marched on a slice of bread and a ladle of thin cabbage soup. By the time they reached American soil, their ribs showed, their belts were drawn tight. Their first step into a U.S. camp brought not only the smell of pine and dust, but something else, something warm, heavy, and impossible to ignore. The smell of food. The kind of smell that makes a stomach remember what it's missing. One prisoner later wrote, "When the guard told us to line up for the mess hall, I thought it was a trick. I had not smelled bread like that in years. And the coffee, it was real coffee. I did not believe it until I tasted it." That disbelief wasn't just his own. It rippled through the group like a rumor they dared not trust. For a moment, war seemed very far away. The first meal was simple by American standards, but it felt like a feast to men who had been counting calories and crusts. White bread, soft, springy, nothing like the dark, heavy loaves back home. A slab of meat, thick with juices. Potatoes, buttered and salted. A slice of apple pie that seemed almost too sweet to be real. And coffee, strong and steaming, poured into tin mugs until the air filled with a scent they thought belonged only in stories. The guards, too, ate their meals from the same kitchen. There was no separate table with richer fare. The equality stunned the prisoners, some of whom had grown up believing Americans were savage brutes. Instead, they found a place where soldiers, guards, and prisoners alike lined up for food from the same pots. One prisoner scribbled home, "I do not know if I can describe it to you, Mother. They serve us better than our own army ever did." I almost cried when I saw butter. His letter was censored, but that line slipped through. In Germany, his family received it with disbelief. Butter was a rumor by then, rationed down to a sliver that barely glazed the crust of a loaf. That first night, full for the first time in months, many prisoners lay awake in their bunks. Their stomachs were unaccustomed to such abundance. Some whispered in the dark, asking if the food would continue, or if this was some trick to weaken their defenses. Others silently promised themselves to eat slowly next time, afraid it might be the last. By 1944, Germany's home front was hollowed out by hunger. Rations had fallen to 1,200 calories per day for civilians, barely enough for survival. Bread was stretched with fillers, sawdust, ground-up chestnuts, even ground straw in some regions. Meat became memory. Coffee was no longer coffee but roasted barley, acorns, or chicory. Families boiled turnips into endless stews, each pot thinner than the last. And yet, across the Atlantic, German soldiers in captivity found themselves gaining weight. They wrote letters describing meals their families couldn't imagine. Pancakes for breakfast, stew thick with beef, cornbread with butter. Many letters returned with short, confused replies. "Surely you exaggerate. How could prisoners eat better than free people?" In truth, the U.S. followed the Geneva Conventions carefully, sometimes even exceeding them. The policy was practical. If American POWs were captured, they hoped for reciprocal treatment. But to the men in the camps, it felt like a dream they could not wake from. Hunger had been part of their identity, a constant companion of soldiering. Now, suddenly, that companion had vanished, replaced by fullness that carried a weight of its own. One recalled later, "We did not know if it was kindness or arrogance. Perhaps America was so rich they could afford to feed enemies like this. Whatever it was, I ate every bite." The cultural shocks stretched far beyond the taste buds. Breakfast, for example, was a battlefield of confusion. Germans were accustomed to starting their mornings with a hunk of dark bread and a cup of weak coffee. When American cooks set down trays of scrambled eggs, bacon, and flapjacks drizzled with syrup, some prisoners stared in silence. A few refused to touch the food at first, convinced it was some trick to sicken them. But hunger overpowered hesitation. One soldier later admitted, "I had never tasted bacon before. The fat sizzled and melted on my tongue. I thought it was too much, too decadent, but I ate it all." Others learned to love peanut butter, though not without laughter. The sticky paste clung to their teeth, and some joked it must be a prank food. Yet over time, letters went home asking families if such things existed in Germany, if perhaps they had simply never known. Food became a kind of bridge. Guards would sometimes explain the dishes, chuckling as Germans puzzled over hot dogs or corn on the cob. Prisoners, in turn, shared stories of sauerkraut and rye bread. Kitchens became classrooms where cultures clashed and mingled over steaming pots. The letters home carried more than menus. They carried disbelief. Families struggling to stretch rations couldn't reconcile the idea of captured sons dining on cake and coffee. Some accused them of exaggeration. Others thought it was Allied propaganda, designed to break German morale. Yet the details were too vivid to ignore. One POW described the texture of mashed potatoes, smooth as cream, with butter melting like gold. Another spoke of canned peaches, syrup dripping down his chin, sweeter than anything he had tasted since childhood. For censors, these letters were tricky. They wanted to prevent information leaks, yet they knew the power of such words. Letting Germans know that their sons were safe and even well-fed could weaken resistance to surrender. So many of these descriptions slipped through untouched. Back in Germany, neighbors gathered to read them aloud. Some scoffed, some wept, some felt anger, not at the Americans, but at their own leaders for leaving families to starve while enemy prisoners ate in abundance abroad. For the first time, cracks appeared in the story the Reich had told about its enemies. For the American guards, serving hearty meals to prisoners wasn't a grand gesture. It was simply procedure. The U.S. Army had established strict rules about nutrition, calculating calories to maintain health and productivity. Prisoners were expected to work, cutting timber, farming fields, repairing roads, and they needed strength for that. Yet to the Germans, every plate carried symbolic weight. Each bite challenged what they had been told about America, that it was decadent, cruel, godless. One Iowa farmer, whose land bordered a camp, remembered the way POWs looked at a slice of pie. They stared as if it were treasure. I gave one of them a second piece once. He thanked me as if I had saved his life. That small act wasn't unusual. Across the country, civilians who worked near camps sometimes shared food with prisoners, astonished that the enemy looked so much like their own sons. The prisoners, in turn, began to write not only about meals, but about the strange kindness of strangers. "They treat us like men," one wrote, "not beasts." For men raised in a culture that glorified hardness and obedience, this treatment chipped away at the rigid walls of hatred. Food was nourishment, yes, but also diplomacy, unspoken and powerful. Not every adjustment came easily. Stomachs that had shrunk from hunger struggled to handle American abundance. Some prisoners fell ill after their first feasts, clutching at cramps as bodies protested the sudden flood of calories. Doctors in the camps warned them to eat slowly, but hunger made patience impossible. Cultural misunderstandings also brewed. Germans often ate bread as the centerpiece of a meal, not a side. They complained that American loaves were too soft, too sweet, too white. Some even begged for darker rye bread, something that tasted like home. In response, certain camps began baking rye loaves when ingredients allowed. That compromise was more than dietary, it was recognition. There were lighter moments, too. Peanut butter became a running joke. Glue for the mouth, one man called it, scribbling the words into a diary. Yet soon he added, "I cannot stop eating it." Corn was another puzzle. Boiled corn on the cob seemed childish to some, more animal feed than food. But roasted and buttered, it became an unexpected favorite. These little cultural shocks softened into laughter. For men who had marched under banners of iron discipline, the discovery of humor in food was itself a kind of freedom. As weeks turned into months, food shaped camp life in ways few predicted. Kitchens became hubs of activity, staffed by prisoners who volunteered to cook. They learned American recipes, blending them with German techniques, and sometimes produced hybrids, stews thickened with dumplings, breads flavored with local spices. Guards tasted them too, and soon mealtime became a rare moment where captor and captive blurred into something more human. Work details often tied directly to food. Prisoners sent to farms helped with harvests, hauling wheat and picking fruit. Farmers, bound by rules to pay wages, sometimes slipped extra food into their baskets. One recalled, "The farmer's wife gave me a glass of milk, fresh and cold. I had not tasted milk in years. I nearly wept." Letters about these moments poured back to Europe. The effect was twofold. Morale at home faltered, but for the men in captivity, a strange respect for America began to grow. Many later admitted it was not the barbed wire or the rifles that marked them most, but the meals they had never expected. Still, not all was abundance. In some camps, shortages developed as the war dragged on. Substitutions crept into the menus, powdered eggs, and canned meat replacing fresh. Prisoners grumbled, but even then the fare outstripped what their families had at home. Complaints were almost guilty, whispered in private. The biggest divide came not from scarcity, but from hierarchy. Officers expected better food, as tradition dictated. Enlisted men often mocked this, saying Americans made no such distinctions. In the mess hall, a private and a colonel might stand in the same line, tray in hand, no rank to separate them. For some Germans, this was more shocking than the meals themselves, equality at the dinner table. One later said, "I could not understand how a general would eat the same beans as a private. It was strange, but it was fair. I began to envy it." That envy would linger, reshaping ideas about authority long after the war ended. Decades later, interviews with former prisoners revealed how vividly these meals stayed with them. Battlefields faded in memory, but the taste of cornbread, the shock of bacon, the sweetness of peaches remained sharp. For many, it was the first time they believed hunger was not inevitable. One recalled, "I was 20 years old, and I had never eaten until full. In America, as a prisoner, I did." Another said, "I could not hate men who gave us food. It broke the walls inside me." Historians sometimes dismiss these recollections as minor details, but to the men who lived them, food was survival, dignity, even revelation. It was proof that an enemy could be merciful, that war did not erase humanity. And so, the story of German POWs in America is not only one of fences and guards. It is a story told through kitchens, plates, and letters that carried the smell of bread across oceans. By the second month, routines had settled. Roll call, work details, evening checks. But it was the mess hall that anchored the rhythm of captivity. Men marked their days not by calendar dates, but by the meals that punctuated them. Breakfast was the soft hum of conversation, the hiss of scrambled eggs hitting the griddle. Lunch came with the clatter of tin trays and the faint sweetness of fruit cocktail. Dinner carried the heavy scent of stews that steamed against frosted windows in winter. Prisoners began to notice how food dulled the edge of time. Hunger had once sharpened their senses, gnawed at them until every moment stretched thin. Now, with stomachs full, hours slid by more gently. A man could rest after labor, knowing his body would be replenished. Even boredom, that enemy of the imprisoned, was softened when one had something to anticipate at mealtime. Some wrote that food gave them back a piece of dignity. In the Wehrmacht, meals had been rushed, served with barked orders and little care. In America, even behind barbed wire, meals arrived with something like ceremony. Trays set, lines formed, cooks dishing out portions with steady hands. It wasn't kindness exactly, but it was order infused with fairness. That fairness astonished them. The contrast with letters from home grew sharper with each passing week. German families described thinning soups and bread stretched with substitutes. A sister in Cologne wrote, "We had a potato, one for the three of us. Mother sliced it as thin as paper." In reply, Her brother, a POW in Texas, admitted, "We had beef stew today, thick with carrots and potatoes." I felt guilty writing it. This guilt haunted many prisoners. They lived with full stomachs while their families starved. Some even asked guards to reduce their portions, as if shame outweighed hunger. A few sent home part of their wages from camp labor, hoping it might ease the burden. Yet the imbalance could not be erased. It created a strange kind of survivor's conflict. Relief for their own safety clashed with anguish for their family's deprivation. Around mess tables, men spoke of it in hushed tones, lowering their voices as if the abundance on their plates might overhear their guilt. The guards, too, noticed the unease. Some tried to ease it with humor, teasing the prisoners about their hearty appetites. But the divide remained, written in every letter that traveled across the ocean. There were moments when food became a bridge beyond the camp itself. Farmers who employed POWs often invited them to share meals in their homes. Though officially discouraged, these invitations happened often, especially in rural areas where labor was scarce and trust grew quickly. One man remembered being handed a slice of pie by a farmer's wife. She served me before her own children. I cannot understand it. I was an enemy, yet she smiled as though I were a guest. That act, small as it was, lodged in his memory for life. Another prisoner recalled sitting at a kitchen table in the Midwest, the scent of roast chicken filling the air. He wrote, "It was the first time I saw America not as soldiers and fences, but as a family at supper." Stories like these spread quietly through the camps, whispered from bunk to bunk. They became legends of sorts, reinforcing the idea that captivity in America was not the nightmare they had been taught to expect. And though not every prisoner was lucky enough to taste such hospitality, the possibility alone shifted their perceptions of the enemy. Food also became a tool of memory. Prisoners recreated dishes from home when supplies allowed, pooling rations and improvising. They carved ovens from brick, baking bread that smelled faintly of rye, though never quite as dense as in Germany. They simmered stews and seasoned them with herbs gathered at the edges of camp fields. In those flavors, faint and imperfect, they tasted echoes of their mother's kitchens. Camps even held cooking contests, where groups of prisoners showcased their creations. Guards often served as judges, laughing at the seriousness with which men defended their dumplings or sauces. These events turned captivity into something resembling community. Men who had once marched under the same flag, but never spoken, became comrades over shared meals. The act of cooking also restored a sense of control. Prisoners had lost nearly everything: freedom, rank, certainty of tomorrow. Yet when they stirred pots and kneaded dough, they shaped something tangible. The taste of a stew was small power, but it mattered. One recalled, "When I baked bread in that camp, for a moment I was not a prisoner. I was a man again." Not all impressions were rosy. Some prisoners resented the abundance, believing it mocked their family's suffering. They wondered if America flaunted its wealth as psychological warfare. "They fatten us while our people starve," one diary read. It is victory served on plates. Yet even this bitterness could not erase the gratitude many felt. Hunger is a universal language, and its relief softens even hardened hearts. A guard once noted, "They would curse us in the yard, but thank us in the kitchen." This paradox defined much of the POW experience. Anger simmered alongside astonishment. Distrust lingered even as bellies filled. Men could not fully reconcile the cruelty of war with the kindness of nourishment. But perhaps that was the point. Food complicated the neat lines of enemy and friend. Over time, most prisoners admitted that mealtimes became the least hostile part of their captivity. And when the war ended and they were shipped home, many carried not just memories of fences and guards, but of bread, butter, and the shock of being treated human. Winter sharpened every sensation in the camps. Frost painted the barbed wire silver, and boots crunched over frozen ground. But inside the mess halls, steam rose in thick clouds, wrapping prisoners in warmth as they stepped through the doors. Soups became heavier, thick with beans or lentils. Bread emerged from ovens still steaming, its crust crackling as knives tore into it. For men who had feared hunger all their lives, those meals were nothing short of salvation. Letters from home during those months often told of desperation. Families scavenged for coal, boiled cabbage until the water was thin as air, and rationed every potato like treasure. One man's mother confessed that she had not tasted meat in over a year. Her son, in a camp in Georgia, wrote back carefully, avoiding details but unable to hide the truth. "We do not go hungry here, and I am ashamed of it when I read your letters." The shame did not erase the gratitude. Prisoners ate with heavy hearts, yet they ate. Hunger does not surrender to guilt. At night, in crowded barracks, they whispered of the contradiction, how captivity had brought them more nourishment than freedom had. It was a strange, bitter miracle. For guards, feeding the enemy was a daily routine. They rarely considered the weight of what it meant. The cooks ladled out portions, washed trays, scrubbed pots. But to the prisoners, each plate carried an unspoken message: you are worth feeding. That message sank deep, changing more minds than speeches or pamphlets ever could. A camp officer once remarked, "They fight us with less anger when they are fed. A full man listens differently than a hungry one." That simple observation captured a profound truth. Food softened defiance. Prisoners grew calmer, less likely to resist orders, more willing to work. And yet, food did more than pacify. It planted seeds of respect. Some Germans admitted later that their hatred began to crumble in the mess hall. "It is difficult to despise a man who shares his bread with you," one reflected decades afterward. Those seeds would matter long after the barbed wire came down. The food itself told stories of America. Corn, unfamiliar to most Germans, appeared in many forms: bread, mush, roasted ears dripping with butter. At first, prisoners mocked it, calling it animal feed. But soon they learned its variety, its sweetness. Some even wrote home about it, trying to describe flavors their families had never known. Then there was coffee. Real coffee, not the roasted barley or acorn blends of wartime Germany. The aroma alone became a comfort, rising in the barracks each morning like a promise that the day would begin with something reliable. Prisoners treasured it, savoring each sip as though it were proof of civilization itself. Even simple items carried cultural weight. Peanut butter baffled them, but slowly became a guilty pleasure. Apples, plentiful in autumn, were eaten raw, baked into pies, or pressed into cider, luxuries unimaginable back home. Through these foods, prisoners tasted not just sustenance, but a vision of abundance that contrasted starkly with the scarcity they had left behind. Food was not always plentiful. Supply chains faltered, substitutions crept in, and some camps saw meals reduced to basics. Yet even then, the difference remained staggering. A German POW in Oklahoma once wrote, "We had beans again, always beans, but I ate until I was full. That is enough." The monotony could frustrate, but never to the point of despair. Men had learned that sameness was still a blessing compared to starvation. They joked about endless beans, endless bread, endless coffee, but they ate every last bite. The true bitterness came not from repetition, but from a knowledge of what their families lacked. One prisoner confessed in a letter, "I sometimes wish I could send half my plate across the ocean." That wish echoed through the camps, a longing as persistent as hunger itself. The guards noticed. Some tried to comfort the men with words, others with extra rations slipped discreetly. But nothing could bridge the ocean between the full and the starving. It was the one wound food could not heal. Despite the distance, food became a strange form of correspondence. Families in Germany wrote about what they dreamed of eating, while prisoners described what they actually had. It was as though they were exchanging menus across continents. One list of deprivation and one of abundance. One mother wrote, "I dream of bread with butter. Just once, butter thick enough to taste." Her son replied, ashamed yet honest, "I eat it every morning. I think of you with every bite." That confession cut deep, a truth that bound them and separated them all at once. Some prisoners stopped describing meals in detail, fearing to wound their families further. Others could not help but write it, needing to share their astonishment, as if disbelief demanded an audience. Either way, food shaped the letters that flowed like veins between America and Germany. And in those letters, the war revealed itself not only as battles and bombings, but as hunger and nourishment, shame and survival. For many, the war was not measured in victories or defeats, but in the weight of bread, the taste of butter, the shock of fullness in a time of emptiness. By spring, camp life carried rhythms that blurred the line between confinement and routine. The barbed wire remained, the guards remained, but meals softened the edges of captivity. Fields near the camps turned green, and farmers who hired POW labor often paid not just in wages but in kindness. Milk, eggs, apples, tokens of normal life, slipped into the hands of men who had expected only hostility. One prisoner later told an interviewer, "I had more fresh fruit in those years than in my childhood." America seemed made of orchards. Another recalled shelling peas with a farmer's children, laughing as they flicked pods at each other. In those kitchens, hunger felt like a bad dream that belonged to another world. Still, guilt followed every bite. The letters from home never stopped telling of shortages, of neighbors fainting in food lines, of children crying for bread that never came. Eating became an act of survival wrapped in sorrow. The prisoners filled their stomachs, but not their consciences. The guards noticed the strange mood. They could not change the war across the ocean, but many tried to ease the men's burdens in small ways. Some shared their own food, candy bars, chewing gum, slices of pie. To the prisoners, these offerings carried a shock of intimacy. It was easier to hate a faceless enemy, one wrote, but the man who gives you chocolate cannot be faceless. There were limits, of course. Discipline remained strict. Attempts to escape were punished. Yet mealtimes softened tensions that discipline alone could not control. Guards found it easier to manage men who were fed. Prisoners found it harder to resist those who treated them with unexpected decency. The paradox deepened. Captivity had stripped them of freedom, but given them nourishment. Hunger no longer defined them, but guilt and confusion often did. They wrestled with it silently, spooning stew into mouths that remembered starvation even as bowls stayed full. Food also revealed cracks in hierarchy. In Germany, officers and enlisted men had always eaten apart, rank dividing even the simplest meal. In American camps, those lines blurred. Mess halls were egalitarian. A colonel and a private stood in the same line, waited for the same ladle of beans. For some officers, this was an insult. For many enlisted men, it was a revelation. "I saw my captain with a tin tray like mine," one soldier wrote. "He looked smaller without his special table. It was the first time I felt equal." This experience lingered. After the war, some former POWs admitted that equality at the dinner line reshaped how they thought about authority. It planted quiet questions that no propaganda could silence. Why must rank demand privilege? Why must men go hungry while officers eat well? The mess hall became, without design, a classroom in democracy. The seasons turned again, and with them, the menus. Summer brought melons and corn, peaches canned in syrup, and tomatoes that burst with juice. Autumn meant apples baked into pies, pumpkins carved into stews. Even in captivity, prisoners tasted the passing of time through produce. They wrote home with descriptions that read like fairy tales. "I ate an orange today. Its skin was like fire, its flesh like sun." To families scraping together turnip soup, these words seemed impossible. Some letters were met with silence, others with scolding replies. "Do not torment us with such fantasies." Yet the prisoners were not boasting. They were grasping for ways to share the astonishment of eating plenty in a world they had thought consumed by war. That astonishment never truly faded. Years later, when asked about America, many remembered not the fences or the guards, but the taste of fruit, ripe and sweet, when they had expected only bitterness. The kitchens themselves became centers of exchange. German prisoners who cooked learned American recipes and taught their own. Sauerkraut bubbled beside chili. Dumplings floated in stews flavored with unfamiliar spices. Guards sometimes requested German dishes, and prisoners obliged, amused at the sight of Americans grimacing at sour cabbage. Cooking was a form of agency. Men who had lost their freedom regained a measure of control through flour, salt, and fire. They carved ovens from brick, shaped pans from scrap metal, improvised utensils from tin. In creating food, they created identity. One recalled proudly, "When I baked bread in that camp, I felt more human than I had in years. The smell filled the barracks, and for a moment we belonged to ourselves." That bread was shared, torn into pieces that carried not just sustenance, but solidarity. In the end, food was never just food. It was memory, culture, dignity, and sometimes forgiveness. The war raged beyond the fences, but inside, meals became their own kind of quiet revolution. By the third year of captivity, the shock of American meals had dulled into habit, yet the memories never lost their weight. Men who had once stared wide-eyed at bacon or pie now ate them with quiet acceptance. But the letters they wrote still carried astonishment, as if words preserved the wonder long after routine set in. "We eat like kings here," one prisoner wrote in 1945, "and it is strange, for we are defeated men." Defeat and nourishment made uneasy companions. Many prisoners wondered why their captors spent so much food on enemies. Some thought it arrogance, others generosity, still others strategy. But whatever the reason, the result was undeniable. Their bodies grew strong again. Sunken cheeks filled out, hollow eyes brightened. When liberation finally came, many returned home looking healthier than when they had been captured. This irony did not escape them. Freedom had brought hunger in Germany. Captivity had brought food in America. It was a reversal so stark that even decades later, men struggled to explain it without shaking their heads in disbelief. The abundance also sparked reflection on what war had meant. For years, soldiers had been told that sacrifice was noble, that deprivation proved loyalty. But in the American camps, nourishment was not tied to ideology. It was simply given, without speeches, without conditions. Prisoners began to see hunger not as destiny, but as design, something inflicted by leaders rather than by nature. One diary entry read, "We starve for a cause that never cared for us. Here, as prisoners, we are fed more honestly than as soldiers." Such realizations stung, but they planted seeds of doubt that no propaganda could uproot. The Geneva Conventions had required humane treatment, but America's adherence to them carried lessons beyond law. It suggested that dignity was possible even in war, that enemies could be treated as men rather than monsters. For some, that realization marked the true beginning of surrender, not to a nation, but to the idea that humanity could cross borders. Even small foods became symbols. Chewing gum, handed out casually by guards, fascinated prisoners. They chewed until the flavor was gone, then chewed still more, laughing at the absurdity of food that could not be swallowed. Chocolate bars, often sent in packages from American families, were treasured like gold. Prisoners would cut them into tiny squares, savoring each one slowly, unwilling to let sweetness vanish too quickly. Cigarettes, too, became a kind of currency, traded for favors or treasured as luxury. They were not food, yet they were consumed with the same intensity, each puff a taste of freedom. Together, gum, chocolate, and cigarettes painted a picture of America as a land where abundance overflowed even into novelties. Prisoners carried these impressions home long after repatriation. Some admitted that the first American products they sought out after the war were gum and chocolate, reminders of captivity that felt more like glimpses of another world. Not all experiences were gentle. There were camps where shortages strained tempers, where guards grew careless, where meals lost their fairness. In those places, resentment festered. Yet even there, food never sank to the deprivation prisoners had known in Europe. Complaints about beans or powdered eggs rang hollow compared to the hunger their families endured. Some men expressed bitterness that captivity had treated them better than service to their own nation. The right gave us slogans. "America gave us bread," one man muttered years later. That contrast etched itself deep into memory, shaping not only how they remembered the war, but how they raised their children afterward. When historians interviewed them decades later, they expected tales of cruelty. Instead, they heard stories of meals, of pies and peaches, of bread that smelled like comfort. The historians often blinked, surprised. But for the men themselves, those memories were not trivial. Hunger and its absence had defined their lives more sharply than bullets ever had. As the war ended and prisoners began to trickle back home, many carried with them not just stories, but visible proof of nourishment. Their families, gaunt and weary, looked upon sons and brothers who seemed healthier than before the war. The irony was bitter. Some families embraced them with relief, others with suspicion. "How could you have eaten so well while we starved?" a sister asked her brother, unable to hide her resentment. The returning men struggled to answer. They had no defense except the truth. America had fed them. For some, that truth became a burden heavier than captivity itself. They spoke of it rarely, as if silence could ease the guilt. But in private, they admitted that food had reshaped them, not only their bodies, but their understanding of the world. And so the story of German POWs in America lives on less in records of battles than in memories of meals. It is a story not of guns or strategies, but of bread, butter, coffee, and the astonishing discovery that even in war, dignity could be served on a plate. Life after captivity was never simple. Many former POWs found themselves haunted not by violence, but by abundance. In Germany, neighbors asked suspiciously why they returned with fuller cheeks, stronger frames, healthier skin. Some assumed collaboration. Others whispered that captivity must have been easy. Few believed the truth, that food had been plentiful, not because prisoners were favored, but because America had chosen to honor laws of war. This gap between perception and reality weighed heavily. Former prisoners often stayed silent about their meals, ashamed to describe pies and roast to families who would starve on turnips and watery bread. Yet silence could not erase memory. Late at night, some admitted to one another that the smell of cornbread still followed them, or that they dreamed of coffee, rich and dark, rising like steam from a tin mug. Food had become both gift and wound. It had saved their bodies, but it had complicated their souls. Historians often focus on numbers, calories allotted, menus recorded, supplies shipped. Yet the deeper truth lay in how those meals felt. To a man who had gone months without butter, a single pat gleamed like treasure. To one who had never tasted a peach, the sweetness shocked him like music. Food carried emotions sharper than statistics. It stirred gratitude, envy, guilt, even love. One POW confessed decades later, "The first time I was served pie, I felt America wanted me to live. That feeling never left me." His words reflected what countless others hinted at. Nourishment was more than fuel. It was recognition, proof that an enemy still deserved humanity. That recognition left marks that endured long after the barbed wire rusted away. For many, it became the foundation of respect for America. A respect born not of politics or power, but of meals shared in captivity. The cultural exchanges born in kitchens proved lasting. Prisoners introduced guards to sauerkraut and dumplings. Guards introduced prisoners to chili and cornbread. Some recipes traveled home with the men, carried in memory or scrawled on scraps of paper. Years later, German families tasted American dishes at dinner tables, served by men who had once eaten them behind fences. One former prisoner taught his children to bake cornbread, insisting it was as vital to his story as uniforms or medals. Another recreated peanut butter sandwiches, laughing at his family's first confused bites. These foods became more than nourishment. They became symbols of survival, bridges to a chapter of life that had been both captivity and revelation. Thus, the legacy of those meals spread far beyond the camps. Food traveled across oceans, folded into family traditions, reshaping even the most private corners of memory. Not every prisoner embraced these memories. Some resented them, convinced that abundance and captivity had dulled their edge as soldiers. They felt humiliated that an enemy had fed them better than their own leaders. It was proof we were lied to, one bitterly remarked. That resentment festered, turning nourishment into a reminder of betrayal. Yet, even among the resentful, the memory of food lingered. They could not erase the taste of butter, the smell of coffee, the shock of plenty. It haunted them in quiet moments, creeping into thoughts unbidden. Anger might twist the memory, but it could not erase it. And so, food remained a paradox. Kindness and humiliation, comfort and shame. For some, it softened hatred. For others, it deepened wounds. But for all, it became inseparable from the story of captivity. By the late 1940s, when most prisoners had returned home, their stories began to slip into silence. Families wanted to hear about battles, not bread. Children asked about uniforms, not kitchens. The world remembered the war in terms of victories and losses, not menus. But in diaries, in whispered conversations, in late-night recollections, food still held its place. It was the detail that could not be forgotten. A man might forget the date of his capture, but he would remember the first time he tasted an American orange. He might forget the names of fellow prisoners, but not the smell of pies cooling on windowsills beyond the wire. In these memories, food stood as quiet testimony. It proved that war did not erase humanity, that even in the darkest chapters, nourishment could carry dignity, and dignity could change how enemies saw each other. Decades later, researchers sat across from these men, tape recorders whirring, expecting tales of punishment or cruelty. Instead, they heard about bread, about butter melting into warm loaves, about coffee strong enough to jolt a weary body back to life. Some historians dismissed these recollections as trivial, but the prisoners insisted. The meals had been the center of their experience. One former POW, interviewed in the 1970s, said simply, "I forgave America because of food." He did not mean that bread erased barbed wire or that pie excused captivity. He meant that nourishment had reminded him of his humanity at a time when war had stripped it away. Food had been proof that he was not just a number or an enemy, but a man worth feeding. The sincerity of such memories startled even seasoned historians. They revealed that history was not always written in battles and treaties, but in the quiet clatter of cutlery, the steam of soup, the sweetness of fruit. Some prisoners carried their food memories into careers. A few returned to Germany and became bakers, inspired by the abundance they had witnessed. Others opened small cafes, introducing American-style pies or cornbread to curious customers. One man proudly advertised his restaurant as recipes from captivity, reclaiming his years behind wire as something more than wasted time. Families sometimes resisted these influences. Wives scolded husbands for adding too much sugar, insisting it was decadent. Children giggled at strange concoctions their fathers insisted were delicious. Yet slowly, these American tastes seeped into German kitchens, altering traditions in ways that could never be traced on a map, but could always be felt at the table. Thus, the legacy of POW meals became woven not only into memory, but into culture itself. War had stolen years, but food had given something back. A new way of cooking, a new way of eating, a new sense of what nourishment could mean. Yet for all the warmth these stories carried, shadows lingered. Some men never escaped the guilt of eating well while their families starved. They avoided speaking of their meals, burying the memories deep. But silence did not erase taste. The smell of coffee would drift from a street cafe, and suddenly they were back in the camp, tray in hand, torn between gratitude and shame. One man confessed late in life, "I could not enjoy butter for years. It reminded me too much of my mother's hunger." Another admitted he rationed food for decades, even in times of plenty, unable to believe abundance would last. These habits, born of contradiction, shaped entire households long after the war had ended. In this way, food became more than survival. It became a scar, visible only in private rituals, in the way bread was sliced thin, in the way leftovers were never wasted, in the way meals carried both comfort and sorrow. American guards, too, remembered. Many spoke later of their surprise at how ordinary the prisoners seemed once seated at a table. The mess hall erased uniforms and accents, reducing men to the simple act of eating together. Guards admitted that their own prejudices softened in those moments. One recalled, "I looked at them chewing pie, and I thought they could be my cousins." These reflections mattered. The humane treatment of prisoners shaped not only the captives, but also the captors. It reminded Americans that even in victory, cruelty was not the only path. The choice to feed, to nourish, to follow the Geneva Conventions reinforced a sense of justice that the nation carried into its post-war identity. Thus, the story of food was not one-sided. It transformed both sides of the fence. Each loaf of bread passed across a counter, each cup of coffee poured into a tin mug, stitched a small thread of humanity into the vast, torn fabric of war. As the last camps closed and prisoners boarded ships home, many carried secret stashes, recipes scribbled on scraps of paper, American coins traded from guards, even empty gum wrappers kept as souvenirs. These small items were tokens of a captivity defined less by chains than by meals. On the voyage back, men swapped stories of what they would miss. Some said freedom mattered more than food, but others admitted quietly, "I will miss the bread." Laughter followed, but it was the laughter of men acknowledging truth they could not deny. When they stepped back onto German soil, the contrast hit hard. Bombed cities, thin children, hungry families. Their memories of abundance clashed painfully with the reality of ruin. Yet tucked in their minds, alongside sorrow, remained the taste of butter, the smell of coffee, the sweetness of pie. It was a memory they would carry for life. Proof that even in defeat, even in captivity, food had given them back their humanity. For years, many former POWs kept their experiences hidden. Pride and politics made it hard to admit that captivity had offered comfort their homeland could not. But when they finally spoke, food was always the first detail they recalled. It had been the surprise that broke fear, the daily ritual that steadied them, the symbol that reshaped their idea of the enemy. Historians later understood what the men already knew. Meals are never only meals. They are acts of culture, of recognition, of quiet diplomacy. In the camps of America, food became the most powerful message sent across the barbed wire. You are still human. Families in Germany, struggling with hunger long after the war, often found these stories hard to hear. Some felt anger, others disbelief. But over time, the truth seeped through. Returning soldiers carried recipes home, baked cornbread for their children, spoke of butter as casually as if it had always been there. Slowly, families began to realize that these tales were not boastful lies, but lived experiences. That realization carried its own pain, but also a strange kind of hope. If enemies could feed their prisoners with dignity, perhaps the world was not entirely broken. Perhaps decency could survive even when bombs had leveled cities and leaders had betrayed their people. In villages across Germany, whispers spread of men who had come back healthier than when they left. Some envied them, some mistrusted them, but many listened closely to their stories. Around kitchen tables, families heard about American pies and peaches, about bread that never ran out, about guards who handed out chocolate. These stories planted seeds in a defeated nation, images of another way of living, one shaped not by slogans and scarcity, but by fairness and abundance. For America, the decision to feed prisoners well was practical, lawful, even strategic. But for the men who lived it, it was personal. It rewrote their understanding of war. They had expected hatred and cruelty. They had found bread and coffee. That contradiction reshaped them in ways no battlefield ever could. One prisoner said simply, "I left Germany a soldier. I returned from America a man." His words echoed a truth many shared. That nourishment had restored not only flesh but dignity, and dignity had changed the course of memory. Even in old age, when memories blurred and names slipped away, the taste of captivity remained vivid. Veterans forgot dates, but remembered peaches. They forgot ranks, but remembered pie. They forgot the order of battles, but remembered bread that came warm from American ovens. In memoirs, these details often appeared with startling clarity. One man wrote, "When I die, I hope the smell of coffee greets me. It will remind me of the days when, though captive, I felt alive." The story of German POWs in America is often told in footnotes, overshadowed by battles and treaties. But within those footnotes lies a quiet revelation. That food became a weapon of peace. It softened hatred, bridged cultures, and planted memories that outlasted barbed wire. War is usually remembered in destruction. Yet here was proof that even in war, nourishment could build something enduring. Bread and butter, pie and coffee. These became symbols of a decency stronger than violence. Some prisoners returned to America years later, not as captives, but as visitors. They stood in fields where camps once stood, now covered in grass or shopping centers. They visited old kitchens, or what remained of them, and told their children, "Here is where I learned that enemies could be kind." In those moments, history folded in on itself. What had once been fear and captivity now became memory and lesson. Food had turned into legacy. For their families, too, the stories became part of inheritance. Children grew up hearing about cornbread and coffee, about pies and peaches, about guards who offered chocolate. These details shaped how a generation viewed the war, not only as loss and ruin, but also as discovery and transformation. Food had connected two worlds divided by war. It had shown that even in the darkest conflict, there was room for humanity. As historians pieced together the mosaic of POW experiences, they realized that food had done more than sustain life. It had sustained hope. It had softened hatred. It had left men with memories they would carry longer than the sound of gunfire. One scholar wrote, "The story of German POWs in America is not one of barbed wire, but of bread." That line, simple and true, captured the heart of what the men themselves had always said. And so the story closes not with battles, but with meals, with bread torn and shared, with butter spread thick, with pies cooling on windowsills, with coffee rising in steam above tin mugs. For the prisoners, these were not small details. They were revelations, proof that even in defeat, they were treated as men, proof that humanity could survive war, proof that dignity could be served one plate at a time. In the end, what they remembered most was not the fences or the guards, not the roll calls or the work details. What they remembered was food, its taste, its warmth, its unexpected kindness. And in that memory, war itself was transformed, not into victory or loss, but into the quiet astonishment of being fed like a human being when they had expected nothing but hunger.